Hey guys, Alex from FastFitnessTips. Yes, today I did something really crazy with my cranks, with my crank fit. I'll get to that in a bit. But for now, is it time to reconsider a change in your crank size? That's what I want to ask you today, guys. Can we look at the subject of crank size and bike fit? How do those two go together? I put it to you that most people are actually riding the wrong crank size. In fact, I would be 99% confident that most people are riding the wrong crank size. And why do I say that? Well, if you look at these geometry charts from Specialized, and they're by no means unique here, you'll notice that despite a wide range of bike fits, they actually only offer certain limited, roughly 3 or 4 crank sizes. But hang on, we can be pretty confident that crank size is very much related to rider height or maybe inseam height. Yeah, there might be a few tweaks here or there, but you know that a wide variety of human beings exist, yeah? In other words, look at height or inseam and you find a normal distribution that looks like this. But if you look at crank size, it looks nothing like that. In fact, in our recent database, our survey of bike fit, which is still open by the way, and I give you a shout to do that if you don't mind, then what we found was 40% of riders are riding with a stock 172.5mm crank. About 30% are riding a 175, 17% riding a 170, and 10% riding a 165. But basically, nearly 100% are riding 4 crank sizes. But wait a second, guys, if we simply map expected crank size against, let's take inseam for men and women, then we get a nice near normal distribution that looks like this. And yes, it is true that the mean and the mode, the most common size required by the population for men is around 172.5, and for women around about 165. Yes, that's statistically true, but people vary. And if you have the option to try or to fit a different crank size, I put it to you right at the top of this video, maybe it's time to look at this. And this video will actually help you get into this in a bit more detail. We'll consider the pros and the cons of going up or down on a crank length. But my conclusion from these graphs is pretty clear that most people are riding with the wrong size. In fact, I would put it to you, most people don't even consider changing their cranks, yet alone have changed their crank size. How many people out there do you know, how many cyclists do you know that go for a bike fit, crank size is hardly discussed, and they basically stick with the stock crank size, whatever that is? I don't know about you, but that's most of the riders I know. So today we're going to talk about crank length in relation to getting a bike fit, positional issues, maybe mechanical, biomechanical issues. What are the basics that we need to consider? Well, let's say you wanted to go towards longer cranks. Well, longer cranks means more leverage, right? Or more torque. Yes, there are other levers. There's obviously gears. It's a complex system, a bicycle. But what I'm saying is, when you think of all things being equal on the bike, then longer cranks mean more of a mechanical advantage. However, let's say straight up that there is also a disadvantage, and that is longer cranks mean a larger pedaling circumference and so longer foot distance per revolution. So in effect, you actually get what probably is a metabolic disadvantage. In fact, I don't need to speculate about that. A number of scientific papers have looked at the oxygen or metabolic cost of cycling with longer, bigger cranks versus smaller cranks. And it turns out that there isn't actually a great deal of difference of riding with longer cranks per se. But there is a difference when you increase foot speed, certainly outside of, let's say, a fairly restricted normal range. And the bottom line is that if you go for longer cranks, if you keep the cadence the same, then obviously foot speed is higher. If you kept the same foot speed, then cadence would be lower with a longer crank. So that's why they say if you like riding with slightly higher cadences, you might favor a slightly shorter crank set. Now, in terms of the mathematics of how much of a difference it makes, this could get really complicated really quickly. But to help you out, at the request of cycling apps very recently, we helped them with the data that powers a little app that is called I Want to Change My Cranks, which basically tells you the foot distance, the cadence difference, the foot speed difference, the torque differences, and even the positional differences that you're going to need to consider when changing up or down your cranks. And you can see that on the screen here. So you can download, if you want to, this nifty little app, and it will help you out with the mathematics of going from one crank size to another. And by the way, that's up or down, whichever way you want to favor. So let's come on to the main consideration of this video, which is about crank length and bike fit. What are the issues? So what are the issues you need to consider when changing your cranks? Well, bike fit, as you know, can get really complicated quite easily, but at its heart, it's actually quite simple. There are 3 contact points. You've got the saddle contact point, you've got the pedals, and you've got the bar. Basically, if you consider those 3 carefully, that is the interface with your body. So in most situations, if you consider those 3, you're going to get a pretty decent bike fit. Okay, there's other subtleties to consider, but if we start on that basis, let's look at the saddle. So what is the effect on the saddle? Basically, what do you need to consider about the saddle if you change your cranks? And why do people get this wrong so often? Well, the trick here is to consider, of course, the pedal at the bottom of the stroke. At the bottom of the stroke, a longer crank length means that you're having to reach down further. So if you go 5 millimeters longer with your cranks, your saddle is going to have to go down 5 millimeters, right? So a longer crank set basically means a lower, not a higher saddle height. And that sounds counterintuitive, I guess, but actually when you think about it at the bottom of the stroke, that seems to make some sense. Further, the distance that you have to move the saddle is very simple. It's exactly the same as the change in the crank length, of course, assuming the fit was correct before. Actually, ironically, often people don't have a perfectly adjusted saddle, and when they move their cranks or change their cranks, they may well find no adjustments necessary, but that's because the saddle height was incorrect before, okay? Now, the second thing we need to consider is regarding the leg at the top of the pedal stroke. You see, if you move the saddle down for longer cranks, then when the pedal comes up to the top of the stroke, you're not just getting the compression that factors in from a longer crank like 5 millimeters, but you've also moved your saddle down 5 millimeters. So in effect, you get a double whammy. And that's the other big heads up in this area, that if you move the saddle down as you're meant to with the longer crank, when the pedal comes up to the top of the pedal stroke, then basically the hip angle is going to be more compressed, and in fact the knee is going to be more compressed as well. Now, it's difficult to put a precise number on it because it depends on your body size, your frame geometry, etc. But let's take a typical rider around about 5'10" with typical inseam, typical foot size, and going, for example, from a 172.5 to a 177.5 causes the hip angle to tighten up, to close up by about 1 1/3 degrees, and the knee to close up by about 2.6 degrees. And that small difference might be critical if you're already on that kind of precipice of feeling that things are tight, things are compressed. If you're riding aggressively, with an acute torso angle, then maybe you're just about accommodating the hip angle as it is. So potentially longer cranks with that double whammy effect causes too much of a hip closure on the hip angle, yes? So the take-home message from this part is that smaller cranks can be more comfortable. They can open up the hip angle. They can open up the knee in terms of reducing knee pain or knee discomfort. It can also reduce hip discomfort in some cases. And as a result, in longer events, particularly triathlon as well, where you tend to be in a more aggressive position, some people favor shorter cranks than maybe the simple mathematical formula would predict. Now, the third factor to consider, and this is, to be honest, quite small change in the grand scheme of things, but it's about the forward-backwards movement of the saddle. You see, when your saddle goes down, obviously with the seat tube angle being what it is, then it goes towards the bars. In other words, it compresses the triangle. And just as a rule of thumb, for every 3, let's say, millimeters it goes down, then the saddle will tend to go forward 1 millimeter. So what this means is, if you want a very precise fit, yet you want to move your saddle up or down, then you may have to adjust the forwards-backwards position accordingly. Now, by the way, there's no reason you can't make this adjustment to the stem or the bars. In theory, you should actually move the stem or the bars, well, the bars and the hand position on the bars, because if you move your saddle down and forwards, you want to actually move the stem down and forwards the same degree. But of course, in the real world, this is difficult because who can move their stem 1 millimeter forward or 2 millimeters forward? It's quite tricky. But moving the saddle forward and backwards is quite easy on the saddle rails. So basically, most people accommodate forward and backwards movement on the saddle by moving the saddle itself, or to be fair, they just ignore this totally, because in all reality, who can actually detect a 1 millimeter forward or backwards difference on their saddle? Hey, maybe you can, and it is important. That's why I'm covering it. But I'm just saying not everyone can. And it depends on the up and down movement in general. If you move your saddle down, let's say 5 centimeters, then, a 1.5 centimeter forward or backward adjustment might be important then, sure. Okay, now there's one final positional issue to consider, but I'm actually going to consider this in a separate video because it is actually really complicated to work out, and that is basically pedal strike. So of course the issue is if you've got a longer crank and you're leaning over, then there'll be occasions, we've all had it as road cyclists, you're going around a bend a little bit too fast, maybe you've got to lean over to maintain your balance, you're still pedaling to maintain your speed, and then bang, you get that horrible sensation as the bottom of the crank, or actually the pedal, hits the road. So you've got to be careful about this. Now, I don't want to wimp out altogether on giving you a heads up on how much you can get away with. I mean, here's a quick chart to show you lean angle, versus crank size. But it depends on the bike, it depends on the Q factor, it depends on the wheel set, it depends on the pedal height, the pedal, length itself, and also the bottom bracket height. That's fundamental as well. So there's a lot of factors to consider, but as a ballpark figure, if you're a middle of the road rider on a medium sized frame, then you can usually look at about a 30-degree lean angle before you have a pedal strike if you continue pedaling through the corners. And if you change your cranks by about 5 millimeters, then 5 millimeter increase in crank length, you'd lose about 1 degree of lean ability. So the bottom line is if you go for longer cranks, you need to be more careful. Obviously, you might not cycle, you might not pedal through all the corners, or you might do something radical and look for a bike with a higher bottom bracket clearance, but this is not something you can adjust easily, that's for sure. Okay, so a question I was often asked, and I was genuinely asked this today on our Strava club, is how do I know if the cranks are the right size for me? Are there any tips on knowing that the cranks are too long or too short actually? Well, in general, the factors that relate to crank being too long are longer. There's a longer list than those related to the crank being too short. So I guess all things being equal, and if you're not sure what crank size to put on, it pays to put on slightly more conservative, smaller set rather than a larger set, let's say. So if you're rounding, it makes sense to round down rather than up. But as a heads up, factors that suggest that your cranks might be too long for you are you get an uncomfortable feeling when you're pedaling, you're pedaling in too large a circle. The circumference of your pedaling feels uncomfortable to you. Second, that you feel that constriction, you feel the angle between your thigh and your torso is too narrow. Basically your hip angle is closed and your torso angle is acute. So therefore, okay, let's put it in black and white terms. Your thigh is hitting your chest or the bottom of your arms. That's not a good sign. And that might be corrected by going to smaller cranks. Also, if your hips are rocking on the bike, in other words, struggling to reach the bottom of the rotation, okay, that's probably a saddle height issue. But if there's no further room to lower the saddle, yeah, sure, then you could look at your crank length in that regard. Also, if your foot speed is too high for a given RPM, well, as we said earlier, that will have a metabolic cost. It might not be the most efficient way to ride, so you might reduce your crank size on that basis. Similarly, if we reverse that and say at a given foot speed, maybe your cadence feels too low. Maybe you're not able to spin up, or you're spinning out actually. If you're spinning out, then that could be an issue for long cranks. And of course, not forgetting the factor we've just mentioned that foot strikes are a problem. So what then is the list relating to cranks being too short? What are the pointers? What are the heads up on your cranks being too short for you? Well, first of all, if you feel uncomfortable with a very tight pedaling circle, I've had this myself. I've put on cranks which are just too short and I felt, this is horrible. I've got like a really weak, small pedaling circle and I'm really, really struggling. I've had that sensation myself. You can also feel with short cranks that your foot speed's too low for a given RPM, or again, conversely, that for a given foot speed, your cadence is too high. That you feel that you're doing too much aerobic work, I guess, and you're not using your muscle power as much as you want to. And I guess in terms of torque, we shouldn't forget that for a given fixed gear, maybe you're on a fixie or a track bike, then maybe you're not generating enough power, but you are generating enough RPM. You're not limited by RPM, but you feel that your power is the limiting factor. Then maybe a longer crank arm could be the answer. And I suppose in general terms, if you're riding short, powerful, explosive events where cadence isn't your rate limiting step, but power is, then like a track sprint, often long cranks would be an advantage. Now in an ideal world, you would do some experimentation with different crank sizes and maybe, different power deliveries. You could do 90, 95, 100, 105, 110% of your FTP over, let's say, 3 or 5 minutes. Repeat in randomized order for each crank size and see if there's any effect on the difference between power and heart rate. Which one feels most comfortable? Do power to heart rate ratio, for example. But in reality, very few people outside of pros are going to go to that extent. What you might do is a little bit of trial and error. Maybe on other people's bikes, you can do it where you adjust, for example, in the store or on a friend's bike who's got a different crank size and see how it feels. But be warned, that can be deceptive because it's only a short-term experiment. Wow guys, that's a lot of theory I've given you today, as well as a couple of nifty calculators that you can try in your own time. But the bottom line that I want to return to now is, come on, how significant are these changes in the real world? Like a 1 millimeter change in your saddle. Come on, most people are not going to notice that. In fact, I was curious about this point myself. I'm curious about the fundamental. Think about it. Let's say you change crank size altogether. 2.5 millimeters is not a lot. Even if you go up 2 complete sizes, that's 5 millimeters. A 5 millimeter change is said to be significant in the cycling literature. Not many people would jump up 2 sizes. Well, as it happens, I've got quite a few spare crank and crank arms lying around, and I thought I'd do something a little bit crazy today. And what I've done then is get the bike out, put it on the trainer, kept one size as 172.5, but on the other side, wait for it, this sounds ludicrous, even as I'm describing it to you, it sounds crazy. On the other side, I've taken off the normal 172.5 crank arm and I've shoved on, which happens to fit of course, the 177.5 crank arm. So hang on, we've got some kind of Frankenstein crank here with a left and a right of different sizes. But wait, I didn't stop there. I fixed it all up, put the pedals back on, got the bike going again on the trainer and rode a couple of Zwift events with an asymmetrical crank size. Now I was fully expecting here to say, yeah, this is a disaster. It feels like shit basically. It feels terrible. No one could manage with 2 size difference left and right. But you know what? That wasn't actually my experience. Yeah, initially it does feel odd. But if you do concentrate on the difference, your brain starts to say, look, let's stop. But if you do something else and concentrate on the ride or concentrate on the screen and don't think about the difference, you know what? Within 5 to 10 minutes, I'm thinking this isn't too bad. Within 10 to 20 minutes, I'm almost forgetting about it. My brain is accommodating this change to such an extent that I would say that a 5 millimeter difference is actually quite hard to tell. Now I've tried it out on the road the proper way, obviously changing the cranks entirely and then riding different crank lengths. And I would say that changing up 2 sizes, I felt on the road, was an appreciable difference. I'm kind of surprised that this horrible experiment doesn't feel so terribly weird that I can say to you that even one size is significant. Now, don't get me wrong, you may be more sensitive than me to crank sizes, and my fundamental point at the top of this video that most people are riding the wrong size holds, because really we should have a precise crank length that fits us best. It works best for our fit, it works best for our position, it works best for our power delivery, and it works best for our gross mechanical efficiency, or just, riding efficiency on the bike. So basically, we should have a more precise option. And I know, yes, you can get customized cranks made at vast expense. But what I'm saying is 99.9% of riders are not doing that. So for today, guys, I want to leave you with the appeal that crank length is actually one of the most changeable but least changed parameters on your bike. It does make a difference, even though the lesson from my experiment is actually your brain can accommodate, your legs can accommodate quite a change, perhaps more of a change than you think, but that doesn't mean to say that change is right for you. There still has to be a point where the crank length is right for you. It's hard for me to say this exact length is right for you without hearing about your riding parameters, your riding details perfectly. But what I'm saying is I want you to consider it a bit more carefully. From now on, I want you to consider the crank length affects not just position, it affects performance, it affects comfort, it affects almost everything about your cycling. So it turns out in cycling, size really does matter, guys. Until next time, Coach Alex signing off. Have a great ride, guys. See you in the next video. Guys, just in closing, I want to give a shout out to our Patreon site, which we preview most videos 1 to 2 weeks early. We've got a number of exclusive calculators, and any support that you can give us is very welcome. In addition to that, we've got our Strava site of Fast Fitness Tips. Please join us on that Strava club. And we've also got our open survey right now of bike fit versus body size and shape. And it'd be great if you can contribute. 100 people have done this survey so far. Link in the description below. Thanks a lot, guys.